Hello and good morning from the Freedom of Information and Privacy Association. I'm Patrick Farnsworth. This is your Access and Privacy Online News Summary for Saturday, April 25th. This week, access to information rights are under pressure in Ontario and British Columbia. Civil society is warning Parliament about Bill C-22, and new Ipsos polling shows Canadians want stronger privacy rules for federal political parties. We'll also look at how FOI records, AI policy, connected vehicles, and major privacy and rights stories from the United States and Europe. Let's dive in. We'll begin with a cluster of stories about public engagement, political privacy, and the future of access rights. In Ontario, the Ford government moved to bypass public hearings on its Freedom of Information changes after introducing a retroactive law that would shield the Premier, cabinet ministers, and their offices from public access to records. The government has fast-tracked several pieces of legislation over the past year, including laws to ban speed cameras, close supervised consumption sites, boost the education minister's powers, and more. The proposal has drawn criticism because Premier Doug Ford acknowledged that part of the rationale was to stop a global news request for his cell phone records. Opposition leaders called the move an attack on accountability and warned that canceling hearings sends a clear message that the government does not want public scrutiny. Some have said it's hypocritical coming from a government that is demanding more accountability from elected school trustees. The broader omnibus budget bill has now passed final vote at Queen's Park. That means the access to information changes are moving ahead as part of a much larger budget package, one that also includes unrelated measures on conservation authorities, redevelopment near the Rogers Centre, and resale ticket prices. The Ontario NDP leader claimed this is a move from Ford to hide his involvement in scandals and that the budget will create endless debt for the next generation. The transparency concern here is not just the substance of the FOI changes, but the process. Major restrictions on public access were folded into a budget bill and rushed through without the ordinary public hearing process. And here in British Columbia, Les Lane in the Times Colonist and Vaughn Palmer in the Vancouver Sun are both warning about the direction of the province's FOI changes. Their columns point to the same core issue FIPA has been tracking, that governments are narrowing public access while presenting those changes as technical modernization. One such example is that of a one-word change requiring officials to respond without delay to without reasonable delay. While a small change, it allows for more excuses to be viable regarding delays to FOI requests, which will in turn become reasons for future delays. The concern is that the public's right to know is being weakened not through one dramatic repeal, but through layered exceptions, expanded discretion, and procedural barriers. Turning to Ottawa and work through our friends at the International Civil Monitoring Group. Civil society, rights, and privacy organizations and experts are calling on Parliament to withdraw Bill C-22, the proposed Lawful Access Act. The concern is that expanded access to personal information by law enforcement and security agencies must not move ahead without strong safeguards, independent oversight, and clear limits. The group warns that Part 2 of Bill C-22 remains, at its core, a mass surveillance capability regime. It would compel an enormous and poorly defined set of electronic service providers to build surveillance backdoors into their products. This significantly weakens everybody's digital safety, and their use cannot be limited to Canadian law enforcement alone. At stake is the balance between public safety powers and the privacy rights of people in Canada. There's also new public engagement on political privacy. VoterPrivacy.ca warns that federal political parties continue to operate outside the privacy rules that apply to many other organizations, even as they collect, profile, share, and target voters using personal information. Some concerns are that the Privacy Commissioner of Canada cannot scrutinize how parties handle personal data, lack of consequences for parties not meeting minimum privacy requirements, no reasonable limit to how much personal data is collected, and the inability to find out what personal information parties have. As part of that, a new national Ipsos poll, commissioned by FIPA, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, the Centre for Digital Rights, and Open Media, found that federal political parties ranked last among institutions tested for privacy trust. Only 33% of respondents trusted parties to protect personal information to some degree, while 60% had little or no trust. The poll also found 80% support for requiring federal political parties to follow the same privacy rules as businesses and public sector organizations, and 84% support for a right of access to personal information held by parties. We'll have a lot more on these stories in the weeks ahead, with commentaries being created now. Turning to Canadian access stories. A municipal code of conduct case is raising questions about confidentiality and retaliation risks for people who file complaints. Erin Lamb's name was disclosed without authorization after she anonymously filed complaints against the mayor and a councillor in Three Rivers. The CIO acknowledged disclosing the name of one of the people who filed the complaint anonymously does not fall within the permitted circumstances outlined in Section 17 of the town's Access to Information and Protection of Personal Information bylaw. An investigation found that one complaint was dismissed, but the unauthorized disclosure itself became a central accountability issue. The second independent investigator report based on Lamb's complaints found the mayor had breached the code of conduct by failing to intervene and de-escalate the interaction between a councillor and a resident. The case is a reminder that access and accountability systems depend on trust, and that people may be discouraged from coming forward if confidentiality protections fail. In Ontario, the province is reversing course and selling a $29 million private jet purchase for Premier Doug Ford. The purchase of the used Bombardier Challenger 650 drew immediate backlash after it was revealed, with opposition parties calling it a waste of public money during an affordability crisis. In 2019, Ford brushed off the idea of spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on a plane. Ford said the province had heard the criticism and agreed that now was not the right time for the expense. Originally, the Ford government rationalized it by saying it would be cheaper than the $107 million Quebec taxpayers paid for two new Challenger jets and one used one. The access issue is familiar. Public backlash followed disclosure, and disclosure forced a policy reversal. Staying in Ontario, Premier Ford is promising that no more inmates will be improperly released from jail after reports that more than 150 inmates had been released in error between 2021 and 2025. The documents show the majority of mistakes were made at the jails and in court. Some were administrative, while others were human error. A follow-up report said 6 mistakenly released inmates remained at large. This came to light after it was said that every inmate was captured instantaneously. The story points to a basic public administration problem. When government systems fail, the public needs clear answers about what happened, how records were managed, and what controls are being put in place to prevent recurrence. And FOI documents are also central to new reporting on a deadly listeria outbreak linked to a plant-based milk facility. The Public Health Agency of Canada said the outbreak led to 20 reported illnesses, 15 hospitalizations, and 3 deaths. The documents describe troubling conditions at the facility, with experts saying the record suggested it had become a haven for listeria. Several of these infractions had not been shared previously. This is one of those stories where access to information is not abstract. FOI records help reconstruct what was known, what was documented, and whether inspection and food safety systems were working as intended. The Pickering production line was immediately shut down after the recall and never resumed. LGI reporter Lexi McFarlane at the Times-Chronicle reports that the town of Oliver is wrestling with how to regulate artificial intelligence use in municipal business. A draft policy would limit AI use for town matters to Microsoft Copilot in the town's enterprise environment, while barring staff, council, and contractors from entering personal or confidential information into the system. A provision in the policy would also require staff to review and confirm any AI-generated content produced from Copilot before formalizing it through sharing, publishing, or making an official town position. Council also discussed whether the policy should be treated as a living document, updated as the technology changes. The town stresses the importance of keeping important and sensitive information on a closed system. The takeaway is practical. Local governments are already making AI governance decisions, even as the risks around confidentiality accuracy, and public records continue to evolve. Turning to a quick segment on separate Canadian privacy stories from political parties and Bill C-22. Canada's Privacy Commissioner, Philippe Dufresne, is warning that stronger data laws are needed as Canada prepares for the arrival of more Chinese electric vehicles. This includes stronger enforcement abilities for private sector privacy laws. Connected vehicles can collect highly sensitive information, including location data, driving behavior, contacts, communications, and other personal details. The privacy concern is not simply the vehicle itself, but the broader data ecosystem around telematics, manufacturers, insurers, apps, and infrastructure. One Canadian who was detained by Beijing for nearly 3 years and is now a senior advisor in the International Crisis Group said the EV deal with China risks creating deeper entanglements with an increasingly totalitarian state, so strong limits need to be in place. As FIPA has warned in past work on connected cars, vehicle data can become a powerful surveillance architecture if collection, retention, sharing, and security are not tightly governed. In Quebec, the city of Montreal is in court, trying to overturn a landmark ruling on police racial profiling. Lawyers for the city asked the Court of Appeal to reverse a class action decision that found racial profiling by police had occurred. A lawyer representing the city told a panel of Court of Appeal justices that damages should not have been ordered to an unspecified number of victims when the trial judge heard testimony from only one member of the class action. The judge said the trial judge's decision was based on insufficient proof because it relied on one witness and on statistics from the police department. Shifting to the United States. In Ohio, Republicans are planning major spending to defend a Senate seat while a bribery scandal continues to hang over the political landscape. It was recently announced that $79 million would be spent on John Husted's behalf. Husted was recently called to testify as a defense witness in the related criminal trial of 2 former energy executives, testimony he might have to reprise after a hung jury led to a mistrial in the case. Husted's calendars were obtained through a public records request, raising questions about his dealings with key players who have been indicted or imprisoned in the scheme. The story is a reminder that campaign finance, lobbying influence, and corruption investigations all depend on strong disclosure rules and public scrutiny. In Arizona, election drama in the state's largest county is already shaping a major midterms year. The county has been a regular target of election conspiracy theorists and is pivotal for deciding statewide races in one of the nation's most important political backgrounds, leaving an air of uncertainty about how midterms will go. One Republican has been engaged in a bitter legal feud with the County Board of Supervisors over election procedures, has put in place a controversial system for checking signatures on mail ballots, and has run voter records through a federal system to check for non-citizens, despite questions about its accuracy. For voters, confidence depends not only on results, but transparent processes, reliable records, and clear safeguards. The Associated Press is also reporting on problems in the backgrounds of some newly hired ICE officers, raising oversight concerns as enforcement agencies expand. The AP focused on more than 40 officers who recently made public their new jobs as ICE officers on LinkedIn pages, using public records to check their backgrounds. It was found that some of the recent ICE hires had been previously accused of misconduct, and many were strapped for cash, which might make them susceptible to bribery and extortion attempts. And in Massachusetts, a legal aid program is helping immigrants navigate court, where access to records and advice can determine whether people can respond meaningfully to government action. The Massachusetts Access to Counsel Initiative launched at the end of 2025 to ensure in-state migrants have legal representation in their removal proceedings. The state legislature created the program in response to the federal government's mass deportation campaign. As of February, there were more than 126,724 removal cases pending against Massachusetts residents in immigration court, with almost 52% of people having representation. Finally, Utah is pushing ahead with state-level AI regulation despite federal pressure for a single national standard. President Trump has routinely tried to stamp out state-level AI policies, and he issued an executive order that included legal threats and funding penalties to deter new regulations. About 8 in 10 people in the United States said they were concerned or very concerned about AI in a Quinnipiac poll last month, with about 3/4 saying government is not doing enough to regulate the technology. Meanwhile, California is resisting demands for sensitive data connected to trans and abortion care. Under a bill that may soon pass the legislature, California medical providers and affiliated businesses could face hefty state fines if they comply with a federal subpoena seeking abortion, gender-affirming, or reproductive care information without first notifying the California Attorney General, patients, and providers. The bill is in response to efforts the Trump administration and conservative states have undertaken to block or criminalize abortion services and care for transgender people. Together, these stories show a familiar pattern. As technology, health information, and enforcement powers collide, privacy protections increasingly depend on whether states can set and defend their own rules. Now to international stories. In the United Kingdom, Prime Minister Keir Starmer continues to face pressure over the appointment of Peter Mandelson. 2 related stories this week focused on the political fallout, with Starmer rejecting calls to resign even as criticism continued to build. Starmer has appointed a self-professed best pal of convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein as ambassador to the United States despite failing security checks. Starmer says he was not informed that the Foreign Office had overruled the recommendation of security officials in early 2025 not to give Mandelson the job. For Access and privacy watchers, the issue is broader than one appointment. It's about vetting, transparency, political judgment, and whether the public receives enough information to assess who is being placed in positions of influence. With a steady trickle of information revealed through increased scrutiny and access, the issue has no signs of going away soon. And in Europe, the Court of Justice of the European Union has ruled that Hungary's anti-LGBTQ legislation violates EU law. The law restricted the availability of LGBTQ content to minors, while also providing harsher penalties for crimes of pedophilia, and was widely criticized by human rights groups. The court found it breached European Union law and a foundational treaty commitment to human rights and equality. It also found that the law breached rules relating to services in the EU's internal market, as well as data protection laws. The decision is a major rights ruling, and it also speaks to information access. When governments restrict what people can read, see, discuss, or learn, those limits become both civil liberties issues and access to information issues. That's it for this week's Access and Privacy Online News Summary. Thank you for listening, and thank you for following the stories that shape privacy, transparency, and democratic accountability in Canada and beyond. You can subscribe to Access and Privacy Online wherever you get your podcasts. You can also support FIPA's work by becoming a member, making a donation, or subscribing to our news monitoring service. This episode was written by Sean Fisk. Music is by Breakmaster Cylinder. I'm Patrick Farnsworth. This is Access and Privacy Online from the Freedom of Information and Privacy Association. Thank you for listening. Stay safe and stay informed.